H.R. 946, a bill to enhance citizen access to government information and services by establishing that government documents issued to the public must be written clearly and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
In recognition of Sunshine Week, today we are considering H.R. 946, legislation aimed at making the government more open and accessible. H.R. 946, the Plain Language Act, was introduced by Representative Bruce Braley of Iowa. This bill requires agencies to use plain writing in government documents. The administration recently issued a directive on open government. One of the central principles of the directive is that information should be accessible. This is the aim of this bill. This bill will make information more accessible by requiring agencies to write documents in a way that is clear and easily understood. We often focus on the need to make information available, but even if information is available, it isn't useful unless it can be understood. AARP wrote a letter supporting this bill that says the use of plain language in documents issued to the public will save the federal government an enormous amount of time now spent helping citizens understand the correspondence they receive. It will also reduce errors in the public's response to the information the government sends out, as well as minimize complaints from frustrated citizens trying to decipher overly dense and non-transparent communications. Madam Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this worthy bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the bill.
The gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I want to join with my colleague from Missouri on supporting this bill, and I really think that we need to see more bills like this. Plain language sounds so simple, but for so long the American people have been asking for Washington to do what it tells everyone else to do, and that's reform itself. You shouldn't have to hire a lawyer to be able to understand what the government's telling you or doing, and sadly that's been historically the fact. And I want to thank the author of this bill for bringing this forward, and I hope that this is the beginning of the melting of the gridlock of always trying to not change the way Washington operates. I hope this is a beginning of saying, before we ask the private citizens to change the way they live, their lifestyle, the way they act, before we start asking the private sector to reform their way of operation, we should lead through example by changing the way Washington operates and the way the federal government relates not just to its services but to its constituency. And I think this bill does that. I think one of the greatest frustrations that we find out in the American people today is the fact they feel that Washington is disconnected. And a bill like this points out how disconnected, that when we can't even send out notices to inform our citizens of what's going on, what they need to do, or what's possible, we can't even do it in plain language. We have to do it in a legalese that may sound good here in Washington, but is not understood out in the real streets of America. So I ask my colleagues again to use this as an example of just the first of many. And so we can look at not just reforming how we communicate, but how we govern, how we represent, and how we tell the American people we really do finally care enough to change the way we're operating, and that for once Washington is going to lead through example rather than edict. And I would again compliment my author and the representative, the majority, for bringing this forward, and I reserve my time.
Reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Madam Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield to the chief sponsor of this legislation, my friend from Iowa, Representative Brady, as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my friend from Missouri for giving me time to speak on this bill. I thank my colleague from California for his impassioned support of this bill, because I believe this is the little engine that could, in terms of how we change the way that the federal government communicates with American citizens. And I think that people would find it surprising to know that somebody who spent his life practicing law would be introducing this bill. But the amazing thing is I was introduced to the concept of plain language in the Iowa Supreme Court's 1983 decision requiring all jury instructions to be written in plain language so people could understand how their laws impact them. That's why this bill is so important, because it gives the government the responsibility to communicate effectively with the citizens that we serve. One of the things that is so amazing is that when you look at most government publications, you would think they were not written for their intended audience. And that is the basic premise of the plain language movement. Is when you write, you think about your intended audience and how you communicate effectively with them in words that they can understand. This bill requires the federal government to write documents such as letters from the Social Security Administration, notices from the Department of Veterans Affairs, in simple, easy to understand language. When I first introduced this bill in the 110th Congress, I was pleased when it passed the House floor by a vote of 376 to 1. Unfortunately, it was never taken up by the Senate. And I'm hopeful and confident that this time around it will be considered by the Senate and signed into law so that the public will get the kind of government service they deserve. As my colleague has pointed out, a large array of organizations who deal with our constituents that are impacted by federal policies support this movement. And I want to thank the Oversight and Government Reform Chairman, my colleague Ed Towns, and Ranking Member Darrell Issa for their support of this important bill, and also thank Oversight Government Reform staffer Krista Boyd for all of her help in making this happen. Anyone who's done their own taxes knows the headache of trying to understand pages and pages of confusing forms and instructions. There's no reason why this bill can't eliminate federal gobbledygook, and that we can honor our friend and former colleague Maury Maverick Sr., who coined the phrase gobbledygook in describing bureaucratic language that is as hard to understand as the call of wild turkeys in his native Texas. I would also remind my colleagues that this plain language in government communications has been incorporated into the Senate-passed health care bill. It was incorporated into the House-passed health care bill, and it's important that we move forward from this point in changing the way that government speaks to its citizens. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Again, I'd like to thank the author, and let me clarify. There's many of us that could explain what the turkeys are talking about in Texas, but I don't think it's appropriate at this floor. But I would have to say that you're right. So much of these documentations are written where the public can't understand it. And to be blunt about it, as somebody who's worked in government since I was 24, they don't want the public to understand it. They purposely think that legalese and elite discussion and text is some way to be able to safeguard traditional government structures. And I think that this breaks down that. I think you would agree. And I'll say this as a former mayor, if a city manager sent out a letter to a constituent of a mayor or city council member in the manner that the federal government sends it out, that city manager wouldn't be employed for very long. And I think that's the same standard that we should hold for the federal government. If it isn't appropriate for our councilmen, our mayors, our school district representatives to send out those kind of information, to have that kind of relationship between the constituency and the taxpayer and the government, then doggone it, shouldn't be appropriate for the federal government to think that somehow we're so high and mighty that we can't break down and finally start using plain speech and straight talk. And I think that that's what your bill starts with. And I think it is a step in the right direction. I just hope to see us follow us through. And I'll say this personally. My wife's a tax consultant, and I would love to see the day that we make the IRS and tax consultant obsolete, and so I can see more of my wife during certain time, put them both out of business, and maybe this is one step in there. I yield to the gentleman from Iowa.
I think you've hit on a very important point, and that is we don't realize how much time and money are wasted by people trying to figure out forms that they can't understand. They call federal agencies, they go into phone trees where they go on hold, and they wait and wait and wait. This can be small business owners. It can be elected officials at the level that you're talking about, because a lot of the policies we set intersect with local and state government agencies. And because of that, by improving the quality of information we're providing at the outset, it's going to greatly reduce the demands on many federal employees, and that's another side effect of this legislation. And I can't agree more with you that it's important to take this step now so that we can start to send a message that we are serious about improved transparency in our communications with our constituents, and I think that it's great that we're moving forward in a bipartisan step to do that.
Well, reclaiming my time, I'd actually even ask the gentleman to take a look at the fact that it's sad that in the United States, that if you go to the translated interpretations of our government regs, they tend to be much more simply put and much easier to understand than the so-called English legalese that's being put out there. So I think the challenge is really one that is long and waiting. And so thank you very much for it, and I reserve the remainder of my time, Madam Chair.
Gently reminded to address their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from Missouri.
Madam Speaker, I would like to now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Towns.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to first thank the chair of the subcommittee and, of course, the chair, ranking member of the full committee, Congressman Issa, and, of course, Congressman Clay, who chairs the subcommittee, and Congressman Bilbray, who the ranking member of the subcommittee, and Congressman Brawley, who was really responsible for us being here today to move this legislation forward. This is Sunshine Week, and this is sunshine legislation. This bill requires government documents to be in plain writing. The bill defines plain writing as writing that the intended audience can readily understand and use because it is clear, concise, well organized, and follows other best practices of plain writing. Requiring government documents to be written clearly will make it easier for Americans to understand government communications, and it will make the federal government more accountable. President Clinton issued a memo in 1998 directing agencies to write documents in plain language. 12 years have passed since that memo was written, and most agencies are still not taking the issue very seriously. But I think this legislation will let them know that this is something that we're not going to walk away from. It is important that they follow through. And a letter supporting this bill, the American College of Physicians Foundation wrote, "We frequently hear from our members that they have trouble understanding some government letters and forms. Our intent is to ensure that government documents created for consumers are clearly and plainly written." H.R. 946 was amended during committee consideration to focus the scope of the bill on the type of documents that are most in need of attention. As amended, the bill requires agencies to use plain writing in documents that deal with the federal benefits of services. This means, for example, that the Department of Health and Human Services will have to use plain writing when it is issues instructions under the Medicare prescription drug program, and I think that is so important. The bill also requires the IRS to write tax documents in plain writing, and it requires agencies to use plain writing in documents that explain how to comply with the federal requirements. This will make it easier for Americans, especially small businesses, to comply with the law. In a letter supporting H.R. 946, a group of small businesses, organizations wrote, and small business owners, I should say as well, strive to adhere to a vast array of federal obligations that often have difficulty deciphering what is being required of them. So, Madam Speaker, on that note, Madam Speaker,
30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
I'd like to thank the gentleman for yielding me an additional 30 seconds. The use of plain language is a common sense approach to saving the federal government money and small business owners' time, effort, and money. This legislation makes good sense. It is good government, and I encourage my colleagues to support it.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Yes, Madam Chair, I yield myself as much time as may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I just want to use this instance to thank Chairman Towns. In a time when the American people are crying out for bipartisan effort, I think his leadership on a very critical committee, the Oversight Committee, has been stellar in the manner that the rest of America, I think, would love to see the rest of this town operate as well as your committee does, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for that bipartisan effort, including everyone in your process. And I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Madam Speaker, I am prepared to close if the gentleman from California.
Gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much. I would yield what time I may consume and just say that I, again, call on all of us to vote together to support this bill and to use it as a marker for more progress at clarifying and opening up the government process and allowing the average citizen to participate. And the only way to do that is for Washington to change the way we do business. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In closing, let me first thank the gentleman from California for his comments and remarks about common sense and disclosure. The bill requires each agency to train its employees in plain writing and to report annually on the agency's efforts to comply with this act. Under this bill, each agency must devote a section of its website to its plain writing efforts. Agencies also must provide a way for members of the public to provide input. This will allow small businesses or other members of the public to highlight particular documents that are complex or confusing. This bill will make the government more transparent and efficient, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Question now occurs. Will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 946 as amended? All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative. The rules are suspended.
Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Madam Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing till counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.